Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first night of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire's Global Forum Fundraiser. We are so happy that you have joined us tonight and really appreciate all you do to support the Council. This year certainly has been a tough one for us all in many ways, and it is because of your continued backing that the Council is able to continue to bring great events like these to you online. You are the true champions of international affairs and strong citizen diplomats for our country. Tonight, I will save you all from my long intro about the Council and our nonprofit, nonpartisan membership status, except for a quick reminder that the views and opinions expressed here tonight do not necessarily reflect those of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, its board, staff, sponsors, or supporters. We are here as a platform for you to better understand the complex global issues, and we hope that you use this information to form your own opinions on the subject. Speaking of sponsors, I want to take the time to thank our sponsors for these Global Forum events. Thank you to our patron sponsors, Stephen and Karen Bardendaler, Bob Blair and Trish Murphy, Carolyn and Phil Paulman, Jack and Carol Resch, Carolyn and Stuart Richmond, Dave and Missy Schroeder, Steve Solomon, Andy Suplee, Ginny and Joe Simonowski, and Norm and Pat Turcott. Your invaluable support helps to keep the Council going strong. We would also like to thank both McLean Middleton and CCA Global Partners for their robust sponsorship of these two events. You are leaders in the cause of global understanding, and your continued support means the world to us. I would now like to bring up Rachel Hampe, Counsel in the Litigation Department at McLean Middleton, and WACNH board member to say a few words.
Good evening. As Tim mentioned, I am Rachel Hampe, and I'm a longtime board member of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. I'm also an attorney in the litigation department of the McLean Middleton Law Firm, which has 5 locations in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. We have over 100 attorneys, and we recently celebrated our 100th anniversary. Our colleagues have a long-standing tradition of civic and community involvement, and we are proud supporters of the World Affairs Council. We are especially delighted to be sponsoring tonight's very timely discussion, and we are pleased to support the Council in its commitment to bringing to New Hampshire, in person or via Zoom, distinguished speakers like Secretary Perry and Director Collina. Thank you for this opportunity, and to tonight's speakers, guests, and event organizers. Welcome all. And with that, I hand it back to you, Tim.
Thank you, Rachel. Again, the support of these two great organizations is vital to the continued success of the Council. We cannot thank you enough. Before I introduce our wonderful speakers, just a quick plug about how you can send us your questions throughout tonight's event. We will be accepting questions through the Messenger app located right here on your screen, as well as through the Council email and on social media. We are hoping to have a lot of time for questions, so please send them in early and often. We will get to as many as we can tonight. Now, without further ado, the part you have all been waiting for. Secretary William Perry was Secretary of Defense from February 3rd, 1994 to January 23rd, 1997 under President Bill Clinton. He also served as U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering in the Carter administration, and has spent his career working to reduce the dangers of nuclear weapons. Secretary Perry is a founding board member of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working to reduce the threat of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. He is also an advisory board member for the Partnership for a Secure America, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to recreating the bipartisan center in American national security and foreign policy fields, just to cite a few of his current efforts. With such a distinguished career in government and the private sector, Secretary Perry has a deep depth of knowledge on the issues we will be speaking about tonight. Secretary Perry is also joined tonight by Tom Collina, Director of Policy at Ploughshares Fund. He is the co-author with the Secretary of the book, The Button, The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump, published in June 2020. Collina has 30 years of Washington, D.C. experience in nuclear weapons, missile defense, and non-proliferation issues, and has held senior positions at the Arms Control Association, the Institute for Science and International Security, and the Union of Concerned Scientists. He has been directly involved with the efforts to end U.S. nuclear testing, limit ineffective anti-missile programs, extend the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and secure Senate ratification of the New START Treaty, which is due for renewal in February. Thank you both for joining us tonight, and we look forward to your insights into this timely discussion.
Well, Tim, thank you very much. And thanks very much to the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire for having us here tonight. We have a brief slide presentation that I'm going to run through, and then we're going to be excited to take your questions. As Tim said, I'm Tom Collina, Policy Director at the Ploughshares Fund, and I had the honor of writing this book with Secretary Perry, which was published this summer. And we wrote this book as a blueprint for what the next president should do on nuclear weapons. And now we know who that next president will be. So let's get to the central question. What should the Biden-Harris administration do to reduce the risk of nuclear war? First, some context. Nuclear policy does not happen in a bubble. The incoming Biden-Harris administration will face unprecedented challenges, from the coronavirus pandemic to systemic racial injustice to global warming, and is going to take literally mountains of money to tackle these crises, and we will need to spend it. So we have to ask, are any of these challenges addressed by nuclear weapons? Clearly not. Yet the United States is planning to spend well over $1 trillion to rebuild its nuclear arsenal. To us, this makes no sense, and the Biden-Harris team can and should redirect a large chunk of this nuclear funding to address more pressing needs. But this is not just about money. We need to change policy too. The bomb does not address the most serious threats we face, and in fact, it can make those threats even worse. So let's unpack this. Here is President Trump with the infamous football, the briefcase that contains everything the president needs to start nuclear war. This is literally how close we are to nuclear war every day, every minute, right now. President Trump, and most people don't realize this, can order an attack on his own authority, no second opinions required from Congress or the Secretary of Defense or anyone else. Now, as you know, the president had COVID in October, and the nuclear football followed him to Walter Reed Medical Center. He was heavily medicated, and even so did not transfer launch control. For those days, the only thing that stood between us and nuclear war was one person with COVID on mood-altering drugs. Now, you would think this cannot be the plan, but in fact, it is. Now, ultimately, this is not about our current president or the next president. All presidents make mistakes. All are human. And that is why we strongly believe that no single human should control the future of humanity, and we must change the policy of sole authority. We, the American people, choose to give presidents this absolute power, and that means we can take it away. So let's talk about how. In our book, we make this central argument. First, that U.S. policy is focused on the wrong threat of a surprise attack from Russia. Such an attack, we feel, is highly unlikely for the simple reason that it would mean the utter destruction of both sides. And yet U.S. nuclear policy has been based on this threat for decades. Now, here's the big problem. This mistaken threat assessment increases the risk of blundering into nuclear war by mistake. We could start nuclear war in response to a false alarm, one of the greatest dangers in the world, and we just don't need to take this risk. Instead, we must move away from quick launch policies and give the president more decision time. So, Bill, turning to you, you had a front row seat to the arms race and met Soviet and Russian officials many times. Some might challenge our central assertion that a surprise attack from Russia is not a likely threat. What would you say to that?
I'd say that's a mistaken view of the world. I've met with hundreds of Russian leaders, from the president, Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs on down, and many private citizens. One thing I can say with great confidence, whatever else I think about the Russians, they are not stupid and they are not suicidal. Therefore, they're not going to launch a surprise attack against us because it would be the end of their country as well. So we have been focused on the wrong threat. A surprise attack, a bolt out of the blue against the United States is not realistic. What is realistic is that we will blunder into a nuclear war. And that's where we should be focusing our attention on. How to reduce the risk of blundering into a war. Tom?
So the perceived threat of a surprise attack drives the military requirement that we must be ready to launch nuclear weapons at all times within minutes. And this in turn drives three dangerous policies. The president, as I mentioned, has sole authority to launch nuclear weapons within minutes with no second opinion or oversight. The president can order a first strike and is not limited to retaliation, something also not widely recognized. And third, the president can launch hundreds of ICBMs, land-based ballistic missiles, on warning of attack without waiting for proof of attack. Bill, if you could please give us your sense of why this combination of policies is so dangerous.
It's particularly dangerous because of our history of false alarms. There have been 5 false alarms that I'm personally aware of, where either Russia or the United States believed that they were under attack and were getting ready to launch their missiles in return. One in particular I want to call to your attention happened when I was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering during the Cold War. When the watch officer at the North American Air Defense Command called me at 3 o'clock in the morning, woke me up, and the first thing he said to me was that his computers were showing 200 missiles, ICBMs, on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. I'll never forget that moment. But quickly he added, he had concluded his computers were in error, and he was calling me. I was the technical person to Pentagon. He was calling me to see if I could help him figure out what had gone wrong with his computers. Well, the short answer to that is we were not able to determine that by a phone call, and it took several days to determine. It was as simple as a faulty microchip in the computer. One little lousy microchip had gone wrong, and it caused the computer to give false signals. But before he called me, the watch officer had already called the White House. Before he knew it was a false alarm, he had already called the White House. And the National Security Advisor took the call and was about to wake up the president and tell him that the 200 missiles were on the way, and should he authorize the launch of our missiles before the Soviet missiles struck. Had he done that, had he made that call, we would have launched hundreds of American missiles at the Soviet Union, thinking we were under attack and thinking our missiles were going to be destroyed in their silos. And we would have accidentally started a nuclear war. So that's the danger of a false alarm, is that we may respond to it by launching our own missiles. And we have come very close to that 3 times in the United States and 2 times in Russia. I call your attention to a movie that was made by one of the Russian false alarms. The movie was called The Man Who Saved the World. And in that movie, it describes an actual incident. This was still when Russia was the Soviet Union, an actual incident where the Russian watch officer thought that a missile attack was occurring on Russia. He didn't know what was wrong with this, but he thought it was not. He thought it was a false alarm. All of his instructions, all of his procedures required him to alert the president of the Soviet Union about this. But he was so convinced that this was a false alarm that he did not do that. Well, it turned out he was right, and a few minutes later, they were able to determine he was right. But again, it came down to one man making the decision not to pass the message up to the president. Who knows what the president of the Soviet Union would have done had he gotten that message, again, in the middle of the night. So these are not theoretical dangers. They're very real dangers. They have actually occurred at least 5 times. Happily, none of those 5 times did we respond, or did the Soviets respond, or we would not be here talking today. So this is a very dangerous situation. We've lived with that danger successfully now all through the Cold War. Now we're still living with it, even though the Cold War is over, and it's time to get away from this policy of launch on warning. Tom, back to you.
Thank you. Trying to advance my slide here. All right. Let's expand on the dangers of sole authority. In 1963, President Kennedy warned that we could stumble into nuclear war due to accident or miscalculation or madness. Bill, can you explain how this might happen?
Well, either through bad information or through an unstable decider or through false alarms. I've already talked about the false alarm which President Carter received. Going back to President Kennedy, he was the one who got us through the Cuban Missile Crisis. But we came very close to the Cuban Missile Crisis, to launching a nuclear war, because President Kennedy was getting bad information. He himself, after the crisis was over, said that he thought the likelihood, the probability of the Cuban Missile Crisis erupting into a nuclear war, a nuclear catastrophe, was about 1 in 3. 1 in 3, which is a not very good odds, and you consider that the other end of those odds would be the ending of our civilization. But even Kennedy's estimate, in my judgment, was optimistic, because when he made that statement, he did not know that the Russians, in addition to having the medium-range missiles in Cuba not yet operational, also had some shorter-range missiles in Cuba, not long enough to reach the United States, but they were missiles with nuclear warheads ready to go. And had Kennedy accepted the unanimous advice of his military advisors to launch a military attack on Cuba, a conventional military attack on Cuba, our troops would have been decimated on the beachhead with tactical nuclear weapons, and the general nuclear war would surely have followed. So those are the examples from history which lead me to be very, very concerned, which I think all of our public should know about as we make our decisions about how we set our nuclear policies. Tom, back to you.
So let's move on to solutions. The next U.S. president, President Biden, can and must reorient nuclear policy away from a Russian surprise attack to preventing accidental war. And Bill, can you lay out our main arguments for how to do this?
Well, first of all, we should end sole authority. The president today, on his own, without any consultation, and in a matter of minutes, can decide to launch nuclear weapons. We did that because we felt that the president might have to act quickly in the case of a surprise attack. And so because of our worry about a surprise attack from the Soviet Union, we set up a policy which made us highly vulnerable to blundering into a nuclear war. And so the probability of blundering into war is far, far greater than the likelihood that we're ever going to get a surprise attack. So we should end sole authority, require the president to have consultation, perhaps with senior members of Congress, perhaps with his Secretary of Defense. There are many ways you could do this. All of them have the either advantage or disadvantage, depending on your point of view, of slowing the process down. From my point of view, it's a great advantage to slow this process down. If we're going to end the civilization as we know it, what's the hurry about doing that? Let's take 10, 15, 20 minutes, maybe even an hour, maybe even a day to make the decision. So we need to end sole authority. Secondly, we need to establish a policy that nuclear weapons are for the purpose of deterring an attack on the United States, and they will not be used for any other purpose. Particularly, we should be prohibiting the first use of nuclear weapons. The weapons are there not for first use, not for attacking another country, but for a deterrent attack on our country. And so we can safely prohibit first use. And finally, I believe we should simply phase out our land-based ICBMs. They are the reason that we have the fear that we need to launch quickly. They are the reason that we're most likely to have, if we were to have an accidental launch, if we were to blunder into nuclear war, the most likely cause of that would be a response to our land-based ICBMs, believing that our land-based ICBMs were under attack, and we wanted to quickly launch them before they were destroyed in their silos. You have to understand that when we built our ICBMs decades ago, we put them in very strong, reinforced concrete silos so that they could not be destroyed before they were launched. But since then, within a decade or two since then, both we and the Soviet Union had developed highly accurate ICBMs, and accurate enough that they can destroy ICBMs even in their silos. So what started out as being a highly invulnerable weapon turns out to be a highly vulnerable weapon, and one that is causing us, and yet we still keep them, and we've compensated for this vulnerability by putting them on a quick launch status. That quick launch status, however, is very, very dangerous because it could lead us into blundering into a nuclear war. Tom, back to you.
So we want to wrap this up to leave plenty of time for questions. So just to conclude, nuclear weapons are the president's weapons, and every 4 years we have a chance to change U.S. nuclear policy. The incoming Biden administration and the current national crisis should inspire us to rethink our approach to national security. U.S. nuclear policy is not doing us any good, is doing us more harm than good, and it magnifies the dangers we face from the most likely nuclear threat, which to us is blundering into nuclear war by mistake. Incoming President Biden can and must fix this. We know this will be hard. We are up against 75 years of outdated thinking and a $50 billion a year industry. History tells us that major change like this is only possible if led by the president with public pressure to deliver. So we are looking to educate the Biden administration, incoming, and the public like you. So thank you very much for listening. And if you're interested in buying the book, you can go to benbellabooks.com and use the code button30 for 30% off. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop my slide share and send it back to Tim.
Well, thank you, Secretary Perry and Tom, for your insights. We've got a lot of great questions coming in here already. We'd like to remind people to continue to send us your questions through our Facebook and Twitter accounts and through our council email or the chat function in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So why don't we go ahead and get started on some of these questions here. We'll start with this one. So where do negotiations on New START stand? Do you think the Biden administration is likely to extend it? Does Putin want this, or will he balk at extension?
Well, I'll start, and then Bill, maybe you can fill in. Yes, the incoming Biden administration has said that they will definitely work to extend the New START treaty. Russia has said that they are willing to extend New START. So really the only question is, can they get it done fast enough? Because after President Biden would be sworn in January, there would be a mere 2 weeks to get it done before the treaty expires. We hope that there's enough clarity within the Biden administration and within President Putin and his administration in Russia to get this done that quickly. It's unfortunate that the Trump administration did not do this when it had the chance. I don't envision the Trump administration getting to this in its last 2 months in office. I think it will be up to the Biden administration. I think they'll be able to get it done, but it's probably, one of the first things a President Biden will have to do in office is pick up the phone, work with President Putin in Russia, and extend New START for up to 5 years without conditions. This is going to have to be a quick, clean extension. And then once that's done, they can sit down and discuss the more difficult issue of what should the next steps be in nuclear reductions. Should we bring in China? Should we include tactical nuclear weapons? Should we include other types of weapons? Those are all important questions, and we'll have time to get to those questions after New START is extended.
Secretary Perry, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think Tom said it just right.
Okay. Well, great. So speaking of treaties, there was the new nuclear prohibition treaty. So what are your thoughts on that treaty? Current administration says it's a bad move and weakens the non-proliferation treaty, which is already out there.
I think two things about it. First of all, it's not going to cause nuclear weapon nations to give up the nuclear weapons. None of the nuclear weapon nations have signed on to it. But it's very important in that it's a symbol of what the world is thinking about this. We have in place today a non-proliferation treaty, which is a good treaty, and which will continue and has served a useful purpose. But what we would like to see in place is a treaty outlawing nuclear weapons. And that's what is being proposed, and that is, I think, serves a very good moral purpose in putting the world on record that most of the nations of the world think the nuclear weapons are illegal and immoral. And that idea, I think, will gradually become prevalent. I point out to you that we have such treaties actually relative to relative to chemical weapons and relative to biological weapons, and they have been successful. So the simplest way of looking at a worldwide treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons and make them illegal is to just simply extend the same sort of agreements we had with the chemical weapons and biological weapons. Tom?
I agree 100%. Just to add that it's interesting that the nuclear weapons ban treaty will come into force just 2 days after the Biden administration is sworn in. And I don't think it's realistic to think that a President Biden would sign this treaty. But I would hope that a Biden administration would see it as a positive development because, of course, the United States, many presidents, probably not President Trump, but almost all other presidents have said that there is a U.S. commitment to the elimination of nuclear weapons eventually. And of course, that is also the goal of the nuclear weapons ban treaty. So there should be some way to join forces with the international community on this. And again, maybe not have the United States at this point sign the treaty, but see it as a positive development towards moving to that ultimate goal.
Like Tom, I do not believe that President Biden will be prepared to simply sign on to this new treaty, at least initially. What he could do initially, though, would be very important, would be to simply state his opinion, his policy, which is the nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. He would be then, in doing so, he would be repeating a statement made first by President Reagan and President Gorbachev. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And having that as the policy of the United States would be a very positive step.
Well, that leads me to a question we heard a lot earlier this year when we were hosting presidential candidates before the New Hampshire First in the Nation primary. We had a lot of questions about having presidents on record as to whether or not they would have a non-first strike policy. Do we have any sense on where the Biden camp leads in that direction?
Well, I think there's good news to report here that the Vice President Biden, now President-elect Biden, has said in the past, and it is his current campaign position, that he would support a policy that the sole purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter their use by others. Now, we support this policy very strongly, and we see it as very similar to a no first use position, which we also support. So we would encourage an incoming Biden administration to formalize that policy of sole purpose, and then to define it in such a way that it becomes synonymous with no first use. And this process may take a while to work out as the new administration implements these policies and figures out exactly what they mean. But I think a Biden administration has already gone a good distance towards a no first use policy.
I would add to what Tom said that besides establishing these policies, which are good things to do, we can back up the policies by the way we deploy our forces, by the way we modernize our forces. There are many concrete steps involving actions by the president, actions by Congress that could manifest our belief in these policies and let the world know we're serious about them.
Just if I could just add on that, the specific policy we'd like to see is the retirement of our land-based ballistic missiles, because these are the weapons that are most likely to be used first in a false alarm situation. They're the weapons that force a president to make a quick decision and possibly a quick launch, possibly in a false alarm scenario, starting nuclear war by mistake. And this will be a big issue for the incoming Biden administration, because the Trump administration signed the first contracts towards a new generation of ICBMs, land-based ballistic missiles. These missiles over their lifetime will cost more than $260 billion. And again, these are weapons that we think make us less safe. So we would much rather spend that $260 billion on much higher priorities. For example, battling COVID-19, addressing global warming, or addressing racial injustice. We have so many other priorities. Let's focus on the things that matter and not spend it on things that actually make us less safe.
I would note that President Biden is going to be go into office with a host of problems to deal with, all of which are going to cost tons of money. And this is one available source of money. So with all these problems you have requiring more money, here's an issue, which is our ICBM, modernizing our ICBM force, at which you can save money and bank that money into solving these other problems, grave problems facing the nation.
Okay, on the idea of ICBMs, can you address the need and likelihood for an international treaty eliminating ICBMs?
Well, the bad news is I don't think the likelihood of that happening anytime in the near future is very high at all. So if we make the move to unilaterally terminate our ICBMs, we have to do it with understanding that we might be doing it unilaterally, all by ourselves. And we have to convince ourselves that it's in our national interest to do it all by ourselves. It's my belief that it is, but I think the decision to do it has to be argued on the possibility, the probability even, that other nations are not going to follow suit, and that we can adequately provide for our own national security without ICBMs. It may require us, for example, to bolster our spending on anti-submarine warfare. It might require us ultimately to strengthen our bomber forces, nuclear bomber forces. But I am completely convinced that we can have a fully credible deterrent, fully capable deterrent, based on our submarines and bombers alone. And we don't have to put up with the risk that the ICBMs pose to us, the risk of an accidental war, blundering into a nuclear war. Tom?
Just, again, agree 100%. Just to add to that, one of the reasons why it would be difficult to have an international ban on ICBMs is because different countries depend on different weapons in different ways. The United States is most dependent on our submarine-based nuclear weapons, our weapons that are based out at sea on submarines. That's where most of the U.S. nuclear weapons are. Russia, on the other hand, bases most of its nuclear weapons on ICBMs. So they would not see it as a fair trade. So we have to be a little flexible about how different nations address these issues, which is why, for example, the New START Treaty doesn't tell you which system to deploy your nuclear weapons on. It just sets an overall cap. And if we brought the next New START treaty into force and bring the forces significantly down, the United States could choose as part of that to eliminate its ICBMs, and Russia would choose to eliminate its weapons in its own fashion. We actually don't need to do this symmetrically. We can maintain deterrence without having equal deployments or even equal numbers.
Not just to elaborate a little bit on this idea of putting our dependence on submarines. We have, any given time, a number of these submarines at sea. Any one of those submarines, any one of them, has enough nuclear power in it to destroy any nation on Earth. Any one of our submarines has enough megatonnage, enough nuclear weapons that they can destroy any Russia or any other country. And every other country in the world knows that as well. So the power of our deterrence is not only in one submarine, but now you have the overkill of all these other extra submarines you have, plus the bombers as an insurance policy. So we have an abundance of killing power. We have an abundance of deterrence power without our ICBMs. So we should not, in my judgment, take the risk that the ICBM poses of blundering us into a nuclear war.
Okay, so back to the idea of no first strike. If we announce we will not strike first, does this not give our enemies an advantage? And in fact, we ended World War II through a first strike on World War II. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, just to start, yes, the United States used nuclear weapons first on Japan in World War II, but no one could strike back. We were the only country that had them. So the United States used nuclear weapons against Japan with no concern that nuclear weapons would come back at us. And that, of course, is the problem with first strike today. If the United States uses nuclear weapons first against Russia or any other nuclear armed country, we would likely, and we'd certainly have to plan on this, see a nuclear response coming back at us. There's no first strike we could mount against Russia that would prevent a retaliation against us, in the same way that there's no first strike that Russia could mount that would prevent our retaliation against them, which is why, frankly, first strike is an insane idea. Because if you launch a first strike, you are opening yourselves up to nuclear devastation, which we have to emphasize could mean the end of civilization as we know it. And that's why nuclear weapons have not been used since 1945, right? 75 years. We've had hundreds, thousands of nuclear weapons. They have not been used for many reasons, but a primary one is that no president wants his legacy to be ending global civilization. And I don't think any future president is going to take that decision lightly either. So I think we see that the first use of nuclear weapons is an option not worth holding on to. And it's much more valuable if we can trade it in to buy ourselves more security against accidental war.
All right. So that actually leads to a question I have. Tom, this may be best for you, but with your background in anti-missile technology and whether or not that works, obviously there's been a lot of work to maybe implement that in South Korea and other places around the world. So what is the viability of anti-missile technology, and does that help prevent that retaliatory strike, or is it a sort of false sense of security that we get from those technologies?
Unfortunately, it's a false sense of security. The concept of missile defense sounds great. And as certainly as President Reagan talked about it, an impenetrable shield that would prevent us from incoming missiles. It's a concept that has proven to be irresistible. And I think most Americans probably think we actually do have such a shield in place right now. And we do have a system that pretends to be that. But unfortunately, the technology is not up to that level. The system we have is limited. It is not effective against large scale threats. from countries such as Russia or even China. So it's not effective against the major threats we face. And instead, what it does, because other countries might feel that it could be effective against a limited strike, it has created a floor for Russia, for example, that won't reduce its nuclear weapons below a certain level, because they feel they have to keep up a certain level of forces that could overcome any missile defense system we have. So while it doesn't meet the promise of defending us against a large-scale attack from Russia, it does serve the purpose of preventing the kind of reductions that we think we need to reduce the threat of nuclear war. And Bill, I'm sure you have more to say on this subject.
Well, we have a whole chapter in our book, not only stating that ballistic missile defense cannot defend the country, but explaining why. It's not just because the people who designed the ballistic missile defenses were dumb. It's because there's a fundamental technical problem. Any defense system, any missile defense system can be defeated by saturation. You don't have to be a physicist to understand that. But you might have to look and be a physicist, but to look into more carefully to understand is why it's so easy to saturate the particular systems we have, which operate in outer space. And because these systems operate in outer space, the attacking force has the option of putting decoys out, very cheap, simple decoys, as simple as plastic balloons coated with mylar. So this gives you the option of multiplying whatever your attacking force is by a factor of 10 or a factor of 100. So in short, it's elementary and simple to defeat the kind of ballistic missile defenses we have by saturation, by the use of decoys. And we have to assume that that's exactly what would happen. So for that reason, I state unequivocally that the ballistic missile defense system we have deployed, or that we're likely to ever be able to deploy in the foreseeable future, is not capable of defending the country. And it's a false security to think that it does.
So a lot has been talked about in terms of the missile defense for South Korea, Japan. How do you assess the risk of a surprise nuclear attack by North Korea against us or our allies?
I put the risk as being close to zero, unless we do something that provokes it. Unless we're doing something which the North Koreans believe is about to end their country, their regime in power. They have those nuclear weapons for simple reason, namely to provide a deterrence to the United States taking military action to overthrow their regime. Their whole purpose is oriented around keeping the regime in power. And the threat to their regime, as they see it, is the United States military attack on them. They believe, and they believe correctly, in fact, that a nuclear force in North Korea can deter that attack. We should be able to understand that because we have our missiles for deterrence as well. So they have it for deterrence, and they clearly understand that if they fire one of those missiles, one of their nuclear missiles, at the United States or at Japan or South Korea, they will be met with a devastating response, and their country will be destroyed and their regime will be destroyed. So deterrence works, and it works both ways.
Okay, so that leads to a good question here. Let me find it. Yeah, so what is the ultimate goal? Is it to have a nuclear weapon-free world? It sounds like perhaps you guys are not going that way with just the land base, but would love to hear your thoughts.
I think that is the ultimate goal. And in fact, I spent 5 or 6 years of my life in partnership with George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn, promoting that goal. And we finally gave up that about 5 or 6 years ago, not because it was the wrong goal, but because we didn't see it as being achievable in the foreseeable future. However, not being willing enough to give up the danger from nuclear weapons, not being willing to give up fighting against the danger of nuclear weapons, I backed off to the goal of reducing the danger of nuclear weapons. In our book, The Button, we describe a number of specific steps that can be taken, some of which we've described already today, that reduce the danger of the nuclear weapons will cause our civilization to be ended. So that's what we're focused on now. But the ultimate goal the ultimate one that I hope we can get to still in my lifetime is to start moving towards the elimination of nuclear weapons.
Okay. A great question just came in. Isn't the real threat from dirty or suitcase bombs from terrorists? How do we protect ourselves against this threat?
No, that's not the real threat, but it is a threat. It's a threat which has in no way compares with the threat of a nuclear war. A nuclear war, as I've said, and it's no hyperbole, really could end our civilization. The destructive power of 100 nuclear weapons being set off in our country or in Russia or any country would be enough to destroy that country and much around them as well. So that's the huge danger. A terrorist bomb is a very serious concern. A real nuclear bomb, if a terrorist would be able to get his hands on a real nuclear bomb, even one with a limited capability, say a Hiroshima bomb, could still cause huge damage. 50, 100,000 people killed in the city, plus widespread economic and social disruption. So that's a very serious threat, but it does not compare with the threat of ending our entire civilization. The third comment I make on that is that there's also the question of a so-called dirty bomb. And that's not even in the same ballpark as it's one terror nuclear bomb being set off in a city. A dirty bomb, I would not call a weapon of mass destruction. It's a weapon of mass disruption. A dirty bomb going off in a city could upset maybe cause the death of a dozen or 2 dozen people, not tens of thousands of people, but it could disrupt the economy in that city because the radioactive material that's spread over several blocks would make those blocks quite unusable for quite a long period of time. So it could seriously disrupt and it could cause a lot of psychological concern, but in no way compares with either one nuclear bomb going off, or certainly had no way compares with a dozen of nuclear bombs that might go off in a general warfare. Just for your readers who are not familiar with the dirty bomb, is a high explosive bomb which has been surrounded by radioactive material. And so the purpose of the dirty bomb is to spread the radioactive material over the several blocks. So you could kill as many people as a high explosive bomb can kill, but you can disrupt that whole area by the presence of that radioactive material into the indefinite future.
All right. So if we do decommission a number of our nuclear weapons, what can we do with this nuclear material? How do we ensure it's safe so that it doesn't become a dirty bomb, etc.?
Let me take a stab at that, because when I was the Secretary of Defense, we actually did decommission 8,000 nuclear weapons, 4,000 in the United States and 4,000 in Russia, and the former Soviet Union, I should say. They were decommissioned, all of the nuclear weapons that were left in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, and there were several thousand of them, were decommissioned at this process. We took in the case of the weapons that were decommissioned in Russia, in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, Russia took the weapons, removed the radioactive material for them, downgraded it, and sent it back to the United States. Sold it to the United States, actually. And we put it in our reactors that generate electricity. And for about 10 years or so time, about half the electricity that was generated by nuclear reactors in our country was being fueled by the fuel from those several thousand bombs which we decommissioned.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful use for it, as long as the reactors remain safe and all of that good stuff. So this person asks, I feel like progress on reducing the number of nuclear weapons has very much stagnated in the past decade or two. Is this an accurate feeling, and is it still an issue on the public's radar?
Yes, that's why we wrote this book.
But I would say it is an accurate feeling that the arsenal reductions have stagnated. We had the New START Treaty that was entered into force almost 10 years ago. And that treaty has been tremendously effective. But we were hoping that in the process of that treaty and during the last 10 years, we would have had another treaty negotiated to go even deeper. in reducing arsenals. But unfortunately, the Obama administration was not able to make progress on that second agreement, even though that was the plan from the beginning. The New START treaty is quite a modest reduction because they always expected to go further. President Obama was not able to do that. And then, of course, we had the Trump administration that went the other way, started to withdraw from arms control treaties. And as we discussed, was simply not willing to extend the New START treaty up to now. So I think the question is exactly right. We've kind of stalled out, and it'll be up to the Biden administration to work with Russia to try to get that process moving again. And I would also say that part of the frustration that's being felt in the global community about that stall out is what has led in some way to the nuclear weapons ban treaty, that the international community eventually said, enough is enough. If you, the nuclear powers, are not going to take on this task and deal with these weapons responsibly, then we're going to do what we can, which is push an international ban on nuclear weapons.
All right. Moving into the idea of hypersonic missiles and whether they can be utilized for a delivery mechanism. And also, I would add to that, what does that do for response time and decision making? And does that heighten the insecurity of the at least land-based nuclear weapons?
Let me start off by saying that hypersonic missiles are very interesting and challenging technology, and one which our engineers are only too happy to develop and have produced. Number one. Number two is they do nothing to change the balance, strategic balance in the world. What they are advertised for doing, what they're praised as being for doing, is they claim to be invulnerable to missile defenses. That's very interesting, but the fact is that the Russian ICBMs, which they already have, are basically invulnerable to missile defenses. So they add nothing really to the threat to the United States. And if we build them, it would add nothing to the threat to Russia because they can't defend against our ICBMs either. So the whole concept of hypersonic missiles is based on the misconception that we have a defense against ballistic missiles, which we do not.
I would just add that this would be a great opportunity for arms control between the United States and Russia and China to say, rather than all of us building these weapons, because if one does, they all will, rather than all of us building these weapons, which we don't need and don't really add anything to our security, why don't we all get together and say, we will not build them? That's the way to go. That's what arms control and diplomacy is for. Unfortunately, we're not seeing any sign of that right now.
Sure. All right. A lot of tonight's discussion has been on sole authority. So if we end sole authority of nuclear weapons, how do we assure we don't have indecision by committee during a crisis?
Well, that's a great question. And that question presumes that you'd want to act quickly. And one of the main points we're trying to make is that when you're confronting the possibility of starting nuclear war, we shouldn't rush into it. There's no reason to rush into a first use decision or a retaliation decision. Because if you rush into it, you're much more likely to make the wrong decision. For example, launching an attack in response to a false alarm. Because you're moving too quickly. So, we would like to see more people involved. We would like to see the president share the nuclear launch authority with Congress or certain members of Congress. Yes, that would slow things down. But again, there's no rush. If you think about it, if there were a nuclear attack coming in, or if there was an alarm of a nuclear attack coming in, there's two options. One, that it's a real attack, and two, that it's a false alarm. Well, if it's a false alarm and you wait, you've just saved the world, right? Because you didn't launch and you didn't create nuclear war. If it's a real attack and you wait, you can still respond with your submarines that are invulnerable at sea. So you lose nothing by waiting. And you could gain everything by waiting. So from that simple analysis, we say there's no reason to rush. And we actually like the fact that by bringing more people into the decision-making process, it slows it down. Because the slower you go, the less likely you are to make a world-ending mistake.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Does the lack of official recognition from Israel that they have nukes prevent any future treaty with all nuclear powers?
Well, I mean, I think that's a long way off. Certainly we need to start with the United States and Russia, since they have 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world. And we have to reduce those forces and then eventually bring China and the other nuclear powers. Israel's forces are much smaller, certainly than the US and Russia. My guess is that Israel and its nuclear forces will first be dealt with in a regional context in the Middle East. And I think the artful way around the fact that Israel will not announce that they have an arsenal is to declare a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East and get all the countries in the region to adhere to that, which would not only include nuclear weapons, but of course, chemical and biological weapons. But unfortunately, the region is in such a state that I'm not holding my breath to get there, but I think that's where we need to go.
Okay, and along that line, is there any hope for further reduction of the world's number of nuclear weapons in the near future?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think we will have a president in President Biden who supports the reduction of nuclear weapons and the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. And if we can get the New START treaty extended, then there's a good chance that the United States and Russia can begin negotiating a follow-on treaty to bring forces even lower. But I have to say that the cautionary tale here is that Congress, and particularly the Senate, which ratifies treaties, is at best, going to be an even split. And it's going to be very hard for a Democratic president to get even a completely reasonable arms control treaty through a Senate with the kind of divisions that we would expect. So I would just put out that caution that even if a President Biden could negotiate an arms reduction treaty, which we sorely need with Russia, it'll be very difficult to get the kind of political support here in the United States that we need.
I would add to that we can get reductions in nuclear weapons in ways beyond treaties. We can make agreements, which the George W. Bush administration was in favor of doing, making agreements that do not require ratification of the Senate, or we can make unilateral reductions. So those are the two other ways to reduce nuclear weapons, other than treaties. And for the reasons that Tom described, that may be what we have to depend on in the immediate years ahead.
All right. Well, I think this is a great way to end it with this question. As we look ahead to a new administration, what can we do as ordinary citizens to ensure progress is made in reducing the nuclear threat?
A great question, Tom. Why don't you take it and I'll add something.
Yeah, that is a great question. And in fact, the reason we wrote this book is to try to educate the public to get more involved in these issues. Because one of the dynamics we saw in the Obama administration is that, look, President Obama was a great advocate for nuclear arms control and reductions and the elimination of nuclear weapons. But when he got into office, many people who were concerned about nuclear weapons said, oh, President Obama, he's got this, right? I can go worry about other things. Well, we couldn't have been more wrong because when President Obama got into office, he realized how hard this was going to be. And the public attention and the public support simply wasn't there in the way that it was for other issues like healthcare. Not that I want universal healthcare too, but there wasn't the political support for the nuclear elimination and reduction agenda that President Obama wanted to achieve. So as we move now into the Biden administration, people cannot go home thinking that President Biden has this covered. He may have good intentions. He may have the right policies, but he will not succeed alone. He needs public support, public pressure, and people need to say very clearly to their members of Congress that this is important to them so that members of Congress will support a Biden arms control agenda as well. Bill, thoughts to add?
Only to reiterate, they were not limited to treaties in making serious improvements. And the president can take actions on his own to reduce the nuclear weapon. They might not be politically popular, but he can do it. And so there are many options for improvements during this new administration that do not require treaties. I would also add that whatever the president decides to do, he needs to have the public support, even public pressure for taking these kind of actions. And that's the basic reason that we wrote this book. We wanted to educate the public on the issue so they will build up the understanding what needs to be done and even the political pressure to get it done.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to Secretary Perry and to Tom for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your time and your wonderful insights into this very tough and sticky situation that we find ourselves in and seem to have found ourselves in pretty much from the get-go of nuclear weapons. We really appreciate your time.
Tim, thank you so much for having us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you again.
Of course. And thank you for all of you for joining us today. We really appreciate your support. We hope that you have enjoyed tonight's event. And we look forward to moving over to the Zoom platform with our patrons and sponsors for an intimate discussion with the Secretary and with Tom, as well as to see many of you on December 2nd for the Future of America's Global Leadership, Night 2 of our global forums here in New Hampshire with Secretary Chuck Hagel. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.